Welcome on this beautiful fall day to Hawthorne Valley Farm. We are located 2 hours north of New York City in the Hudson Valley. Hawthorne Valley Farm is a 400-acre farm. It's a non-for-profit farm and educational organization, and the Farmscape Ecology program is one of the programs of that non-profit. And my name is Claudia Knab-Vispo, and I'm the botanist at the Farmscape Ecology program.
And I'm Conrad Vispo. We're going to give you a little bit of background, and then we're going to actually move around the farm a little bit. I'm a wildlife ecologist, and we've been working, Claudia and I and the rest of our team has been working since about 2003 to look at the interaction of nature and agriculture in our landscape, and both sharing that with the general public and with farmers. So we've kind of come down to two questions that we like to ask, and one is, what can farming provide to biodiversity conservation, and what can wild nature in turn provide to farm production? Our perspective on this is we try to do research and outreach, and that means that the research actually is meant to support the outreach. There's issues and, let's say, things that are happening in our landscape that we think are good to share, but we want to actually be able to look at that ourselves and then share that information. Now, doing primary research in a non-academic location has its challenges. And one of the things that we found is really important is to network and to collaborate with other people. And so, for example, our program has a relationship with the Harvard Forest, and that allows us to have access to the electronic literature, the library, essentially, the Harvard Library. And also, people there have given us a lot of feedback over the years on what we do and how we do it, and that's been really important to us. We also have a relationship now for about the past 5 years with the Hudson Valley Farmhouse, which is down near Kingston, New York. And there we've tried to work together with Anne Bloomfield, who's one of the biologists, or the biologist at the Farm Hub, and put together a research collaborative. And this is formed of both people from two or three different universities, Bard College, SUNY New Paltz, SUNY Cobleskill, and actually a couple of other universities as well, and then some independent researchers and people from Hudsonia, which is another environmental non-for-profit. And so we've tried to put together the pieces there, and with the financial support of the Farm Hub, have been able to attract researchers to work with us on some of these issues. And it's a nice group. But that has been a challenge over the years of how do we actually put together research groups. Why might, say, a researcher from a larger university want to work with us, and really we don't necessarily bring a lot to the table in some ways. So I think that's just a consideration. We've tried to form that research collaborative around a particular question, which is how can you manage on-farm habitat in ways that promote biodiversity and enhance production, and we'll talk more about that. But that's been one of our main, I'd say, challenges over the years. But then on the flip side, the advantage of being in a non-academic situation is that you really have a little bit more freedom, in the sense that we're not beholden to having to publish X number of papers every year. And so we can kind of put together the type of outreach that we think is going to be most effective. We can share the data in the ways that are going to be most effective for us.
So before we talk in more detail about the habitats of Hawthorne Valley Farm and what they provide for biodiversity or nature conservation, I would just like to briefly talk about what kind of a farm Hawthorne Valley Farm actually is. So at the core of the farm is the dairy herd. So there's a dairy and an on-farm processing of the milk into cheese. And the dairy cows from late April until late October rotate through the pastures at Hawthorne Valley Farm. Every morning they get milked in the barn, they come out to a parcel, they eat the grass, they come back into the barn, get milked, and then they go out for the night to another parcel. So twice a day the pasture gets shifted and the cows rotate through the whole farm 4 or 5 times each season. The farm has a variety of different types of pastures. We have pastures on deep soil that are relatively fertile, which is the example here where the cows are grazing right now. But the cows also rotate through wet meadows, through dry meadows, and all that land gets kept open by the grazing cows. And we will look in a little bit more detail at the biodiversity in those different types of pastures. But the green pasture here, I can tell you already, is mostly composed of European grasses and other herbaceous plants that have co-evolved with long years of agriculture in Europe. And native open land plants actually cannot compete with that community of plants on deep and fertile soils. So this type of pasture is not very great for biodiversity conservation. So now we're in a wet meadow, and this is one of the examples of a habitat on the farm that's maintained by occasional grazing by the cows, but it also provides a lot of value for biodiversity. The native plants thrive in here. In general, habitats that are analogous to pre-colonial habitats in our landscape are the ones where you find most biodiversity. And wet meadows pre-colonially have been maintained along streams by beavers. And so there's a lot of different plants that are that have evolved to live with this kind of a habitat, and as long as it kept open, they continue to live here. So we have a variety of different types of asters, like this New England aster. We have Joe Pye weed, this one, I don't know if it's in the picture. We have a variety of different goldenrods, and in general, if you walk into any one of those wet meadows here on the farm, you can easily come up with like 60 different native plant species. And if the farm were to discontinue grazing the cows here, this would grow up into a forest, because the forest is sort of the default habitat in our landscape here in the Northeast. So the farm provides a service to biodiversity by keeping these kind of habitats open.
So this is a pasture where you have a fairly high diversity of native plants. You have a fairly low milk production, not surprisingly. But one of the things to think about is that a lot of the native plants do best on these thin-soiled areas. Once they get into the pastures with deeper soil, the competition with the non-native plants actually becomes more intense, and they're just not able to survive. So if you're looking for a pasture that provides a little bit of service to the cows, but also some biodiversity, then it's probably going to end up looking like this. And so I'm sitting actually amidst, this is little blue stem. It's a native grass. It occurs as far west, occurs into some of the prairies, and you see it on rocky slopes, along sandy riverbanks, that sort of thing. And there's a suite of butterflies, for example, such as the Leonard skipper, the dusty skipper, Indian skipper, which occur along with this plant with the little blue stem. So it's really a little bit of a flagship for us in terms of some of the native biodiversity that can exist on farms. Now, you can certainly ask, why should a farmer maintain a habitat like this? And partially it's to think of other values besides production, if you have the luxury to do that. But also one of the things that's interesting when we talk to the farmer here, the person who runs or has run the dairy herd, is that there's the idea that this might be what's called a medicinal lay. In other words, that the cows can use this periodically and self-medicate to some degree. Now, you wouldn't want them in here all day, every day for the whole summer, but perhaps coming in here periodically gives them the chance to treat themselves for whatever ails them.
So this is one of our beetle banks here at Hawthorne Valley Farm. Hawthorne Valley is a diversified farm that has not just the dairy but also vegetables. And this gave us the opportunity to experiment with a concept that had been developed in Europe and out west in the United States. It's called beetle banks, and it's basically the idea of a narrow strip of perennial vegetation that's allowed to established and maintained within a context of a frequently plowed field situation. And the idea is that this strip of perennial vegetation would serve as shelter and overwintering habitat for beneficial insects, which then come out into the crops and provide ecological services to the farmer. And beetle banks can be established in two different ways. You can either seed them or you can plant them with plugs. In this case, we planted it with plugs. And one important component of beetle banks, and some beetle banks are only composed of that, are bunch grasses. They can be native or non-native. In this case, we have the native Indian grass and native little blue stem to provide the structure of the bunch grasses that provides a lot of overwintering space for spiders and ground beetles and other insects. And then we made the beetle bank nice for pollinators as well by planting several different species of native pollinator plants. And you can see the native asters are still flowering in the middle of October. They're actually buzzing with honeybees right now. And the beetle bank is one of the examples of a beneficial habitat that a farmer can establish on their farm with the help of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, which has a program that's called EQIP, Environmental Quality Improvement Program. And they provide cost sharing for farmers if they want to establish beneficial habitats such as beetle banks or hedgerows on their farms.
The last thing I wanted to say was really to circle back to a couple of aspects of the program. Those were the two questions that I mentioned earlier. The question of what can farms provide to nature, and we've talked a little bit about that in the wet meadows and on the dry fields, and we have done biological surveys in those areas to try to document the biodiversity. The other aspect is what can wild nature provide to farm production. So we've talked a little bit about that. Claudia was just talking about the beetle bank, but we haven't really tried to delve into really how do you measure that. We work with another farm, the Hudson Valley Farm Hub, and there we've set up some experiments to actually try to evaluate the degree to which having habitat like a beetle bank or a pollinator patch would actually help adjacent farm production. And so there we've planted butternut squash and sweet corn next to several different treatments, and those treatments include a high density wildflower meadow, also high density of grasses, and a control, and we've replicated that 3 times. And the question is, do we attract the beneficials that one might hope to see, and do they have the effect that one might hope to see? And I think I would have to be honest, I think I would have to say that so far the answers are mixed. We certainly do attract a fair number of bees, especially bumblebees and honeybees, and butterflies to the meadow that has a lot of wildflowers in it. But there's other beneficials like spiders and tiny parasitic wasps that don't seem so keen on it. We planted butternut squash next to the 3 different types of habitat, and the result has basically been that consistently over 2 years, the squash planted next to the meadow that has a lot of wildflowers has actually produced the least number of squash and the smallest squash. Now, we have not yet looked at the question, how tasty are they? It seemed to be sort of the flip for the sweet corn. We've only done this for 1 year, but we did have higher sweet corn production and somewhat less damage actually next to the wildflower meadows. All of this agroecology is context dependent. And it depends on what sort of farm you are, it depends on what sort of habitat you have on the farm, it depends on the landscape that's around you. So when you're in a landscape like this, where you've got a lot of natural habitat around, adding a small pollinator patch may not make a huge difference for the pollinators. That doesn't mean that the flowers aren't important for the pollinators, nor that the pollinators are not important for the plants or the crops. But it does mean that you have to be realistic in what you expect the results to look like. And we're hoping that through working with farmers and other ecologists and other people associated with agriculture, that we can at least improve the regional knowledge on agroecology.
Mm-hmm. All right, and this is one more parting panorama of Hawthorne Valley Farm from a different vantage point. And notice how the pastures and the vegetable fields and the poultry production are all mixed in with each other, and the hedgerows separating the fields, and then there's another farm pond that has been allowed to silt in and has turned into a wet meadow. So you can sort of get a sense again for the mosaic of habitats that this farm provides, and also the matrix that it's sitting in, which is basically a wooded landscape.